Hello everyone. So today we're going to practice creating complex shapes in Adobe Illustrator and then bringing those shapes into After Effects as I've done here with these gears. So some of the other tutorials I've provided have talked about how to use the pen tool, how to use the shape builder tool, but you can also use primitive shapes in Adobe Illustrator to create more complicated shapes as I've done here. And then we'll talk about how to bring those into After Effects and have each component on its own layer. So I'm going to temporarily hide After Effects and I'll bring up Adobe Illustrator. Again, it's the AI. And I will create a new document over here at the left. And I've created this default document that's 1000 by 1000 pixels. We may change the size of that, but it's a good place to start. And for the preset details over here on the left, I'm going to change the title to Gears and create. Just like with Photoshop, you can press the Command minus and Command plus keys to zoom in and out. Now in Illustrator, these workspaces, these are called artboards. And you can actually have multiple artboards open. And that is one difference between Photoshop and Illustrator. So for example, I could create another artboard and another artboard, and they could all be different sizes and so on. However, we're going to go ahead and just stick with the one artboard. Before we get started looking at the different shape tools offered by Illustrator, I would like to talk about the difference between raster or bitmap graphics, which Photoshop uses primarily, especially when you're editing photos. So I'd like to talk about the difference between raster graphics and vector graphics, which Illustrator primarily uses. And the way we're going to talk about that is by looking at these two triangles. Now, you can see already that the triangle on the left, if you look at the lines, there's a little jagginess to them. And the triangle on the right, the lines are very clean and crisp. So let's zoom in a little bit, and we'll start by looking at the triangle on the left, just so we can see that more clearly. So as we look more closely at these jaggies, we can actually see that it is a collection of pixels, right? So raster or bitmap graphics creates images by an arrangement of pixels on an imaginary grid. Now I'll move over here to the triangle on the right, and we can see once again that the line is very clean and crisp, and I can keep zooming in infinitely, actually, and that line will never lose its sharpness. And the reason why is because this is a vector graphic, which means that it's actually about the relationship between these 3 points. For this tutorial, I would like to focus on the different shape tools that Illustrator has to offer. Just to point out that you can pick one aspect of Illustrator and really expand on that. So you can use these shapes in and of themselves, or you can use shapes to build other shapes. So the rectangle tool, we'll start with that. I'm actually going to change my fill color, right? So no stroke with this blue fill. So with the rectangle tool, I have a choice of either having a perfect square or I can have a rectangle. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? And you'll notice that as I approach a perfect square, I have the shape hints click on to help me create a perfect square. Or I can just go shift click drag and create a perfect square that way. The rounded rectangle tool right below the rectangle tool is a little bit more complicated. So I can click and drag, and you'll notice the corners are quite round. Now if I press the up arrow on my keyboard, those corners continue to get more and more round. And conversely, if I press the down arrow, those corners get a little bit more squared off. So additionally, I can look over at my properties window, and if you don't have that available, you can make sure to turn that on. All right, so I'll just drag my properties window out a little bit so we can see this in relation to the rounded rectangle. Right, so the properties are describing, since I have my rounded rectangle selected, they are describing the rounded rectangle. If I click on these three dots right below the transform options, I can see these pixel numbers relating to each of the corners. The way it is now, all corners are equally rounded. And if I increase the roundness of any one of these corners, all of the corners likewise increase in roundness. However, I can choose to unlock and change this top left number to say 0 and the bottom left number to say 0. And maybe I increase the bottom left corner to, let's make it really dramatic here, 72. So we can see over here with the actual rectangle that I'm able to treat these corners either as a whole and round them equally, or I can kind of unlock and separate the roundness of each corner. Aside from just manipulating these corners through changing the roundness, we can also go to the direct selection tool. So the direct selection tool is right below the selection tool. And what it allows me to do, rather than selecting the entire shape, I can select just one of these anchor points, right? So I'll select this top left one, and none of the other anchor points are selected, and I can click and drag, and you can see how I'm able to affect just that anchor point. And also you'll notice that there are these little Bezier handles, right? So we've talked about those before with regard to motion paths in After Effects, and they serve a similar function here. We're able to change the curves, in this case, of this shape. So I'll go ahead and go back to my selection tool and delete this so that we can talk about yet another tool. So the ellipse tool is much like the rectangle tool, right? So I can click and drag, and I can either have an oval or I can follow the shape hints and have more of a perfect circle. Or I can shift click and drag and have a circle. And just as we did with our rounded rectangle, which turned into a different shape entirely, I could go to my direct selection tool, let's say, and I could click on any one of these anchor points. And you can see I have my Bezier handles right there, and I can change the curve of the circle. I can also select one of those anchor points and press delete on my keyboard, and now I have a semicircle. So we have this polygon tool, and it defaults at a hexagon. However, if you press the down arrow on your keyboard, you can increase the faces of the polygon. If you press the up arrow, you can increase the faces of the polygon until it becomes almost circular. If I press the shift key, the polygon will snap into this upright position. And same thing, I could always go to my direct selection tool. In this case, you'll notice that there are these white circles inside the pentagon. And if I grab one of those circles and bring it in, you'll notice that it has rounded the entire pentagon, right? And now I have an extra set of anchor points at those corners. I have a rounded pentagon. All right, and then finally, we'll look at the star tool. And the default star kind of looks like this. However, if I press the command key on my keyboard and I click and drag, right, I get a star that has sharper points or more nubby points. So I'll create another star, and this time I'll press the Option key on my keyboard. And in this case, I get a star that is more your traditional star on a flag, right? Like a perfect pentagram. And if I press the Shift key, just like with the polygon tool, that star will snap into an upright position. All right, so those are some of the shape tools. And as you can see, there's a lot of ability to create variations and create different kinds of shapes. Let's go ahead and create our gears. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the star tool. I'm just going to click and drag. I did want to point out, if you want to create more points, right? So we start with this 5-pointed star, but if you want to create multiple points, you can click the up arrow on your keyboard, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? For example. And I might even boost that up a little bit more. 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, right? All right. So I'm going to go up here to my selection tool, or V. So my toolbar right here in Illustrator. A lot of similarities to the toolbar in Photoshop, right? So we have the tools over here, and then up here we have the options bar for whichever tool is selected, right? So I can choose fill color, stroke color, how big the stroke is, and so on. All right, I am going to click on that selection tool and just click to deselect. And so what we're looking at here is we're looking at this 16-pointed star. And if I go down here to my color swatches at the bottom of the toolbar, I can see there's a fill color, right, which is white, and then a stroke color, which is black. And then up here, I can see that my stroke width is 1 pixel. So I'm going to go ahead and click back on the star because I'm going to change some things. So first off, I do not want a stroke. I just want it to be a solid color. So I click on the little stroke option at the bottom here and click on None. You can see the little white square with the red slash through it. And then for the fill color, I'm going to double click on that, and I will choose something a little bit more prominent, maybe a nice blue or something, right? All right, so the other thing I wanted to point out, you'll notice when I move my star around in the artboard, there are these little purple lines that pop up, and it actually shows me when I center my star perfectly in the middle of the artboard. All right, so those are really helpful because we're going to be stacking different shapes in order to combine them and subtract and so on. So we need to know when that shape is directly in the center and this kind of thing. So if I go up to my view menu, I can make sure that smart guides are checked. So smart guides are really useful for not just this, but a lot of other things that we won't necessarily be getting into with this practice. So the other thing you could do as an alternative is you could have your align window open, or your align panel, right? So make sure and check mark that. And I'm just going to throw this star off to demonstrate the align, and then I'm going to drag my align panel out. So with the star selected, the first thing I want to do in my align panel is go down to the bottom right and make sure that I have aligned my star to the artboard right there, and not the selection. All right, so I want to align my 16-pointed star to the center of the artboard. So I'll click on first this horizontal align icon. Do that, and then move over to the vertical align icon. All right, and I'll just X out of that panel. I don't need that. But those are two ways to center that object. So we're creating a gear. So what we have to do is we have to take this shape, the 16-pointed star. We have to first chop the points off of this star, and we're going to use something called, and I'll drag this out, this is the Pathfinder panel. This allows us to add shapes, subtract shapes, and combine shapes in different ways. Now, you probably don't have the Pathfinder window open, so you can go to Window and make sure that Pathfinder is checked. All right, so as I said, we're going to take this star and we're going to chop the points off in order to create some nubs for our gear. So I'm going to go over here to where the star tool was, and I'm going to select the ellipse tool. I can either use the smart guides to create a perfect circle, or I can press shift, click, and drag. If you've done that, go ahead and undo as I'm doing. And what we want to do is we actually want to find wherever the center, right? So you can see that little magenta colored text where it says center. We want to find the center of that 16-pointed star. And I'm going to Option, Shift, click, and drag. And you see that circle growing. And I want it to grow out to about right there. And then I up-click, and then I can let go of the keys. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to combine these two shapes. So it looks like I have a blue sun, as it were. So in order to do that, I'll go back up to my selection tool, or I can use the shortcut key V, and I'm just going to draw a big rectangular selection around. And you can see that it's selected both the 16-pointed star and the circle that I've just drawn. Now, I want to take us through the Pathfinder tool before we make the gear and just show you some of the different things that we can do with this. So if I click the first Pathfinder option, Unite, it basically combines this shape. I'll go Command Z, both shapes are selected. I'll go to minus front, right? So it takes the circle away because that was the last thing that we drew, therefore it was in the front. Command Z, and then we have intersect. And we'll stop there because intersect is actually the thing that I want. You can see that the points have been chopped off. Now, I'm going to create another circle that sort of swallows up these little interior points. So I'll go back to my ellipse tool. I'll find that center according to the smart guides. And once again, Option, Shift, click, and drag. You can see my circle is growing just beyond those interior points. And then up click, let go of the keys, and we're getting there. You can see a gear starting to develop, right? So once again, I go to my selection tool, or V, draw a rectangular selection around that. This one, I could do Unite, that'll work. And then I want to get a little hole in the center of my gear. So I choose my ellipse tool. This time I'll draw a very small ellipse. I go to center, Option, Shift, click, drag, around there, and selection tool, and then select all of that. And this time I'm going to minus front, right? Because I want to use that tiny circle that I just created to carve a hole out of the center of that gear. All right, so I'm going to create two more like this, each one its own color. And I want to make sure that I have my layers panel available to me. Again, if you do not have that, you can go Window and make sure that Layers is selected. I'm going to move the Pathfinder panel over a little bit. We don't need that anymore. And I'm just going to click and drag my blue gear down to the Create New Layer icon, all in my Layers panel. And I'll do it one more time. So click and drag the layer down to the Create New Layers icon. All right, so we'll leave this bottom one, we'll leave that gear blue, and so we'll call this blue gear. The second one is directly on top, and I'm just gonna, with my selection tool, drag that out a little bit so we can see that. And I'm gonna change the color to green. So I'll go over here to my fill swatch, double click on that, and navigate with the color picker over to green. We'll put the blue layer on top and then the green gear under it so that the layer order somewhat mimics what we're seeing here. And you can also select layers in Illustrator by clicking on the space over here just to the right of the thumbnails. This bottom one, I'm going to go ahead and call that orange gear, and I'll select that from the color picker. I'll choose an orange. There we go. All right, and then just arrange those in space so that they're a little closer to one another. You might want to round the edges of these just a little so that they mesh a little bit more smoothly together. All right, so I'm going to click on the blue gear, and really this is something that you might have done before you duplicated the gears. It's not too hard to add this effect to the objects. So I'll go to Effect and Stylize and Round Corners, and 3 pixels is probably okay. I can preview that if I want. It doesn't look like much has changed because these blue squares are kind of blocking the view. But if I click OK, you can actually see that there's just a tiny bit of roundness up here, right? And this is this green gear right next to it's a little bit harder. But you could also do a little trial and error and increase the size of those. I'll leave that up to you. So Effect, Stylize, and Round Corners. And maybe I will take this next one up to 4 just so we can, yeah, so these are a little bit more rounded still. So maybe 4 is the way to go. So Effect, Stylize, and Round Corners. All right. Now, if I wanted to get this blue gear to match the green and orange gear in terms of the round corners, I could select that gear. And I want to introduce you to another panel, which is called the Appearance panel. So we'll go up to Window and select Appearance. And the great thing about Appearance is all these properties that we changed, like fill, color, rounded corners, if we added any layer styles, blending modes, all of that information would be found in the Appearance panel. So for example, if I wanted to change the round corners of the blue gear to match the green and orange gear, I could click round corners, and there it is, 3 pixels. I'll change that to 4, and now it matches the others. And this is something that I really like about Illustrator that we don't really find quite as accessible in Photoshop, is this ability to put effects directly onto the layer and then go into the Appearance panel and later edit those effects. All right, so finally what I'm going to do, I've got my gears here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to constrain my artboard to just the area where the gears are. So I don't need all this white space around here. So what I do is I just kind of click off the gears onto the artboard, and I'm going to go to my Properties panel. I've got all my panels spread out here, so I'll clean these up a little bit. So here's my Properties panel. Again, if you don't see that, you can always go up to Window and make sure that that's checkmarked. And the properties are referring now to my artboard since that's what I have selected. So I will click Edit Artboards. And for the preset for the artboard, it's currently set to custom. I'm going to scroll all the way up here and choose Fit to Artwork Bounds. So there we go. The artboard now fits nice and snug against these gears. So I'll go ahead and save this as, and then save this in my assignment 9 practice. All right, so next we will move over to After Effects where we will animate these gears.